All right. Okay, everybody, welcome to the last session of the War and Debt series with Jubilee School Debt Collective's political education organization / project. And tonight we're super lucky, pleased, honored to have Nazia Kazi with us. Nazia is a friend, a comrade, collaborator, and I've had the great pleasure of listening to Nazia talk on a variety of occasions, and it's quite simply some of the best stuff I've heard in terms of foreign policy analysis. And so it's a real honor to have you, Nazia, to give this discussion. And the way that these work is we have a presentation from Nazia. We will then open the room up for a question and answer. But during the talk, if you have questions or comments, go ahead and feel free to put those in the chat. When we do get to a point of having question and answer time, if you could just type the word stack in the chat, it makes it easy for me to keep track of the order in which people will be called on. You could also raise your hand and or make a signal and I'll try and catch it, but it's easiest if it's in stack. So there might be some other people joining us. And as they do, we'll let them in, but right now we're going to turn it over to Nazia, and Nazia, it's all you. Thanks again.
Thanks so much for having me. It's especially nice to be here tonight because it gives me a break from being on hold with my loan servicer, Mohila, who for some reason can't seem to accurately count the number of payments I've made toward the PSLF program. Like maybe they should have majored in STEM, you know what I mean? Anyway, I'll save a dramatic reading of my unhinged messages to my loan servicer for another night. We're really here to think about American militarism, war making, and debt. So as many of you know, on September 15th, 2022, a bunch of US congressmen sent Joe Biden a letter that read, "We write to you to share our concerns about the unintended consequences of your decision to cancel up to $20,000 of student loan debt per borrower. We are particularly concerned about the negative impact this will surely have on our nation's military and their ability to recruit and retain top talent." Okay, so there you have it. American elected officials literally just saying it out loud. Saying out loud that making sure higher education is inaccessible and that using debt as a tool to do so is what makes America able to wage its wars. I mean, they literally just admitted it. And when it comes to militarism and war, American elected officials have this habit of kind of saying the quiet part out loud. Okay, so consider this. When the US went to war with Iraq in 1990, so this was the first war against Saddam Hussein, mind you, but it was hardly the first US involvement in Iraq. In fact, decades before, the US had actually worked with Saddam Hussein to bring him into power. Saddam Hussein had been an ally with the US in its fight against forces in Iraq who wanted, the Iraqi people to control their own oil wealth. But in 1990, when the US went to war in Iraq, George H.W. Bush said out loud, "This will not be another Vietnam." So what had happened in Vietnam that forced Bush, a US president, former CIA director, to make this connection? Was it the rampant and indiscriminate war crimes committed in Vietnam by US forces? Was it the fact that the US had brought the full force of the state down on Vietnam war resistors here in the US? Was it that the US had fabricated and misrepresented key elements about the war in Vietnam to prevent the American public from knowing the full truth of what was going on there? Well, whatever it was, it worked. The US quickly defeated Saddam Hussein in the Persian Gulf crisis of the early 90s. And one, this was a victory against Saddam Hussein, but two, it was a victory against the place the Vietnam War occupied in the American imagination, in America's collective memory. By invading Iraq and swiftly defeating Saddam Hussein, the US state solved the morale problem that came out of America's memory of Vietnam. It was as if we could say now, see, we can win wars quickly and easily. And this is a steady, almost predictable tactic used by the American ruling class to use the previous war as ideological fodder for the next war. The war that just ended gets repackaged and repurposed and mobilized to justify the upcoming war. So just as the first Iraq War was used to solve the Vietnam syndrome, today the war on terror is being rewritten to justify this looming, what people call major power conflict. A major power conflict means the very real and terrifying possibility of direct confrontation between the US and either Russia or China. So for instance, earlier this year, on the 20th anniversary of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, you saw this rewriting happening time and time again. NPR had a piece that claimed not all outcomes were bad and talked about the silver linings of the US invasion of Iraq. And many other media outlets were quick to point to these silver linings of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. An invasion that led directly to the rise of ISIS, an invasion that led to mass civilian death, to massive environmental devastation, to economic crises. And yet here, 20 years later, the US media is quick to whitewash, minimize, and in many ways erase the crime of the century from America's collective consciousness. So we're a nation that goes into debt to fund wars, sometimes even wars between two other countries, right? As we see happening in the case of Ukraine. But we're also a nation of individuals who are put into debt so that we will not question, understand, or resist the wars that the rulers of this nation decide to wage. And this is what we must learn from the very important work of the Debt Collective and this series on war and debt, which is that debt of all kinds, student debt specifically, has this very palpable impact of chipping away at our consciousness, a consciousness that might otherwise be critical of imperialist wars of aggression, that might be critical of the disingenuous reasons we're given for our war making, and that might be critical of the notion that our wars are fought for the purpose of spreading democracy or human rights. So I teach about Islamophobia and the war on terror in South Jersey. And one thing I've noticed over the years is this really interesting contradiction in the classroom. One, that a lot of my students are in some way, either directly or indirectly, involved in the military-industrial complex. They may have had a sibling or parent who was in Iraq or Afghanistan, or maybe they themselves had served or had done some basic training. And two, how little these students actually know about what we call the war on terror itself, in spite of having been surrounded by it their whole life. And so, a few years ago, I decided to study this a little more systematically, to study this sort of systemic ignorance that exists among young Americans who are too young to remember the attacks of 9/11 and the war on terror that followed. And my results, and I mean this seriously, are quite frankly very depressing. About a third of K through 12 teachers have any kind of lesson about 9/11. And when they do have lessons about 9/11, they are all about American victimhood. First responders getting respiratory illnesses, the portraits of families who lost a loved one. Quite often 9/11 lessons are directly connected to the study of American exceptionalism. You study 9/11 on the same day that you learn what makes this country great or why the Constitution is such a fabulous document. You do craft projects making huge American flags. I mean, this is really the bulk of classroom lessons about 9/11. And what isn't taught about 9/11? This is really where my research came in. Quite depressingly, I found that 1 in 5 of my respondents, and these were college students, thought Saddam Hussein was the perpetrator of the 9/11 attacks. Now, this is really striking. I mean, this year, as I said, we marked 2 decades since the US made the decision to invade Iraq based upon known falsehoods. And so as an educator, to learn that young learners have accepted this falsehood, this idea that Iraq, where hundreds, thousands of civilians were killed following the US invasion, was somehow guilty of the 9/11 attacks is truly remarkable. Others thought ISIS, Pakistan, or Palestine were behind the attacks. And in my study, respondents could not name a single reason why the US invaded Afghanistan in 2001. They couldn't tell me what the Patriot Act was, and not one respondent could tell me what happened at the Abu Ghraib prison. So I know we say we should never forget the events of 9/11, but what we've actually done is kind of aggressively forgotten the realities not only of the 9/11 attacks, but the war on terror that followed. And this forgetfulness is a key tool in whatever military incursion comes next, whether it's the war in Ukraine, the expansion of NATO, or further saber rattling against China. So for the purposes of our discussion, what does this mean for schooling and for higher ed? And what does it mean for the increasingly militarized college campus? Nicole Nguyen has written about a curriculum of fear. American public schools, these are schools that are increasingly cash-strapped, especially in working class neighborhoods of color. American public schools solve their budgetary problems by partnering with the Department of Homeland Security, with weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon. So the defense industry steps in and pays for science labs and math programs in schools. And our public schools then produce these young learners who have a security mindset. There are ninth graders learning about parabolas through math problems using a hypothetical North Korean missile, and 10th graders taking classes called Foundations of Homeland Security. And I live in Philadelphia. This is a pretty rapidly gentrifying city, and the city has offered basically tax abatements to people who buy newly built houses. So this gentrification is sped up through these mechanisms, and of course, the schools become underfunded. And then they turn to Boeing or Raytheon to sponsor their science labs. Okay, and then what about the students who go on to college? These students face a similarly militarized environment at the college and university level. So many are not aware of the deep role the CIA or Pentagon has on their campuses, literally sponsoring the research agendas of faculty, recruiting from among students, and just shaping the campus experience in really profound and I think chilling ways. So you see these students who have this sort of security mindset, this idea that there's a terror threat out there and the US state ought to continually work to fight it, and that somehow militarism and war making are effective in the fight against terrorism. The US has even decided that climate change is a security threat, and therefore that the military ought to be expanded and mobilized to fight climate change, which is hilarious when you recall the fact that the US military is the biggest polluter on planet Earth, and that treating climate change as a security threat just means militarizing our borders more to make sure that people who are fleeing floods, extreme heat, drought, and famine caused by, wealthy countries in the global north, making sure that these migrants cannot enter the US and that they're met with the full force of the state when they try. Henry Giraud has written a lot about the militarization of higher ed, and he shows how the values of academic freedom and intellectual curiosity, values that you might think are at the core of the university system, have been aggressively replaced by sort of commercial interests and military interests. And it's true, as I said, labs and research agenda are funded by the Department of Defense or intelligence agencies. Quite often, university administrators have literal ties or came over to academia from their prior careers in national security. And then when you look at the curricula, like degree programs related to, you can literally get a degree in Homeland Security or counterterrorism. And believe me, when you get a degree in one of these fields, you don't learn about the Afghanistan papers that revealed that the US military leaders were lying to us about American losses in Afghanistan. And when you get a degree in one of these fields, you don't learn about Colin Powell lying to the UN 20 years ago to justify the Iraq war. You don't learn about how the Bush administration basically instructed the CIA to invent a reason to invade Iraq in 2003. And you certainly won't learn about Bill Clinton's sanctions regime in Iraq that starved some 500,000 children to death. So this question of forgetfulness is really interesting. I mean, I really think you can't have American militarism without this forgetfulness. It really is the raw material of American militarism. And this is certainly true here in the US, the American population certainly doesn't remember that after 9/11, students were suspended for wearing t-shirts to school protesting the Iraq war. that school teachers were disciplined for critiquing the war on terror in their classrooms. A Palestinian American student was talking to a classmate. He said the word tourist. The teacher heard the word terrorist, and he faced such harsh and permanent discipline that he had to basically hire lawyers. So schooling, K through 12 and higher ed, are spaces where these political tensions become especially clear. So now we know that 38 million people have been displaced, rendered refugees, lost their homes because of the war on terror. So even though people believe that the war on terror is winding down or over, we know that these sort of ripple effects of the war on terror persist. And we also know that the official death count of civilians who lost their lives in US drone attacks is drastically undercounted because, according to the Obama administration, any adult Muslim man was an enemy combatant, not a civilian. So when we look back at these 2 decades of the war on terror, and we look forward at potentially a really frightening conflict between major world powers, here's what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't see the US response to 9/11 as some kind of mistake or a miscalculation, like this oops thing, this approach to US empire building, what Michael Parenti has called the bumbling empire approach, because it prevents us from seeing the very deliberate systems that guide American statecraft. A couple years ago, Paul Krugman wrote in the New York Times, a columnist for the New York Times wrote on Twitter, he said, Americans took 9/11 pretty calmly. There wasn't a mass outbreak of anti-Muslim sentiment or violence, which could have all too easily happened. And while George W. Bush may have been a terrible president, he tried to calm prejudice and not feed it. Okay, so this is what I mean when I say this kind of aggressive forgetfulness. Someone needs to tell Paul Krugman that the detention center at Guantanamo Bay, a Muslims-only prison, remains open. Detention center where torture has taken place, including the very bizarre blasting of Britney Spears songs at maximum volume for days at a time as a form of interrogation. And that the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center exists over there, on a military base in Cuba, because the US wanted to be able to avoid its own laws about how prisoners ought to be treated. So this is what I mean when I say there's a remarkable and troubling rewriting of history that happens. When the plane struck the towers on 9/11, Howard Stern was on air on the radio, and he interrupted his show with the news and immediately said, we need to do some atom bomb hits, some chemical attacks, and kick all the towelhead bastards out of this country. And then he says, we can take the oil for ourselves. I think Bush must have stolen his foreign policy platform from Howard Stern. And I don't think that US empire could work without a population really ready to forget all of this. So let's return to that letter from the congressman about debt and military recruitment. I'm not being conspiratorial when I say that keeping us in debt is a tool for expanding American militarism. These guys said it themselves. It's not conspiratorial. The work of the Debt Collective has shown how free college education that existed in this country, through the interesting historical moments in the 1960s and 70s, began to spark a political awareness and a kind of critical consciousness among the American working class, especially among people of color. So it was free, widely available, high quality higher ed. It posed a serious threat to the ruling class. And one way to eliminate that threat was to tie it to exorbitant tuition and sky-high debt. In other words, it would be a tool to depoliticize the American working class. So the fact that we are straddled with predatory debt is really a tool to chip away at anti-war or anti-imperialist consciousness, making education inaccessible. It doesn't just keep us indebted, and so we're disciplined as workers. It also pushes us into careers and majors and degrees that we are told will pay well, which in an economy like ours will always be at the centers of policing, national security, and finance capital. Basically, those jobs that drive our wars to begin with. So not only is the debt trap a tool to discipline the working class, to make sure we don't go on strike, to make sure we don't risk too much because our bills are due next week, it also prevents us by design from developing the kind of consciousness that might pose a serious challenge to the war industry. So I'll close with this before we hopefully get some time for discussion. One thing you'll hear all the time from the left and from a lot of people I agree with and admire in this country is that we in the US are the richest country in the world. We send billions of dollars to Ukraine, spend billions of dollars to Israel, we spend billions of dollars to bail out high-risk financial institutions that serve the wealthy. We spend billions of dollars on military technology, and surely in this wealthiest country, we can find the money to alleviate the student debt crisis. But I think we need to shift this dialogue a little bit. I think if we're going to make any progress on this issue of debt and war, we need to shift this narrative altogether and challenge this sort of taken for granted narrative of us being the richest country in the world. We are not. We are a country in which the richest few set the terms for how this system works to the detriment of the rest of us, where the richest few always get their debts canceled, but the masses are shamed for being irresponsible when we ask for moderate debt cancellation, where the richest few hoard their wealth and the rest of us spend our last years of life arguing with an insurance company about our medical bills. Where the richest few decide it's worthwhile to spend on wars in countries the average American can't point to on a map. And while many ordinary Americans are recruited to fight in those wars in order to access, the most basic of things, home ownership, health insurance, and of course, for the purposes of our conversation, higher education. So I will pause, I will stop there and see if maybe we have some time for discussion from folks in attendance.
We definitely do, but first a round of applause. Thank you so much, Nazia. A lot to talk about there. And so let's open it up for questions, comments. And do you want to say anything in particular that you find striking or brought about a resurrection? No, you don't have to, but if you want to. And that goes for anyone else. Now, I guess I'll ask a question, Nazia, and then other people can chime in. Again, if you have a question, please write stack in the chat and or raise your hand. Nazia, one thing that really struck me was when you were talking about the K through 12 use of like curriculum and going to the Department of Defense to fill budget holes, which again, are either filled by the Defense Department or Wall Street banks because our schools are underfunded. It really struck me how basically this goes all the way down, right? Like from the moment you enter schooling in this country, you're indoctrinated into this military industrial complex and imperial nation. And I guess I'm wondering, where do you see sites of resistance given how strong the ideological apparatuses are? Schooling, media, it's all around us, our families. I'm wondering where you might see, if at all, because maybe there's not, maybe maybe we're just we're consumed by it, but any sites of resistance that you can think of?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Well, we are possibly on the brink of one of the biggest labor actions in American history, right? I hope everyone is tuned into what's happening with UPS workers right now, which is really interesting given how we all increasingly rely on online shopping to get our packages. And this could really issue a huge threat to, the profit motive of the ruling class. And I think when we look at higher ed this past couple of years, there's been a really big sea change in higher ed organizing. So I'm talking about, not just strikes, which have been really noteworthy, whether, at the new school, et cetera, the UC system, but also union drives more specifically. And I'm talking, I teach at Stockton University. We've had a union since we've existed. But I'm talking about at places like, Northwestern or Yale, institutions that are typically thought of as sort of flush with cash. workers there. And I don't just mean faculty or staff, but I also mean like graduate student workers, and sometimes even undergraduate student workers, grasping sort of the power of the union and pushing, and wherever these drives have happened, they've been really, really successful. That's one thing we ought to know, is whenever there have been union elections, like, campuses voting on whether or not to unionize, they've just had they've won by huge margins. There's no question about it. So look at what's happening in Hollywood right now. And one of the reasons I think this is really interesting is, so if we think, for instance, about what happened earlier, I guess it was the end of last year, December, with the rail workers threatening to go on strike. Of course, the Biden administration came in and decisively took the side of the bosses against the rail industry workers. And to your question about where we see, spaces of resistance or glimmers of hope, at least for the conversations I have in the classroom, I find when students realize that politics is not a choice between the Democrats and the Republicans, and there's a whole other spectrum of political engagement that exists, that is a real teachable moment and a really sort of galvanizing moment as well for people. I think it was really edifying for people to see Biden take that stand on the side of the bosses against the workers, just as I think it was, a decade ago when we saw the Obama administration side with predatory financial institutions against ordinary homeowners, which led to one of the biggest housing crises in this country. I mean, that probably literally led to, the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I lived in New York City at the time, with my remarks earlier about we need to get rid of this false narrative about being the wealthiest country in the world, that chant that we are the 99%, the idea of the 1% and the 99% really comes out of that struggle. So hopefully, we're keeping our eyes on labor struggles. Hopefully we're keeping our eye on the kind of successes in labor struggles that we've seen. And maybe we can draw some hope from that in sometimes what feel like really increasingly hopeless times.
Yeah, and I think the examples you gave today, and I've heard you give before too, about the teachable moments, I think is really, like, I hold on to that as a teacher myself. There's an interesting question that kind of gets into the weeds, and so I'm not sure how much we can address this, but from CG, it says, can you speak to the increasing link between HBCUs and Department of Defense funding / programs as they try to become R1 universities?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, I can speak tangentially to something that I've researched, not directly to this question, but this is certainly happening, right? That there's this sort of multicultural face to American militarism that is, it's kind of a cornerstone of American militarism, the Black and brown faces of American empire. But what I've looked at is the ways in which Muslim America is sort of mobilized as a defender of the military apparatus. So I'm sorry I'm not answering your question directly, but hopefully for, it can complement the knowledge that you have on this subject. There are, and this is true not only for the military apparatus, but for local level law enforcement, there are literal like Muslim inclusionary programs in the military industrial complex to give American war making a sort of more inclusive and tolerant face. So one example I'm thinking of, and I don't know if y'all remember this, but it was right here in Philadelphia. In fact, it was the 2016 DNC, the Democratic National Convention, Hillary Clinton accepting the nomination. And one of the biggest speakers was this Khizr Khan guy, and his son had died. He was Pakistani American, and his son had died in Iraq. And he took the stage and he waved the Constitution around and said, take that, Donald Trump, basically positioning his son's death in American war making as a marker of legitimacy for a war that was by all, measures illegal. And this is a really interesting and very cynical ploy by the war industry. I mean, I mentioned earlier, Colin Powell, who sort of became the Black face of American war making over the course of a couple decades. When Colin Powell spoke to the United Nations in 2003 to sell these lies in the lead up to the invasion, there was a painting behind him. It was Picasso's Guernica, an anti-war painting, and he asked that it be shrouded before he give his talk. which I thought was really interesting. So, in mainstream political discourse, Colin Powell is sort of hailed as this bipartisan leader. He reached across the aisle, he brought everyone together, and he ostensibly sold the Iraq War. And we can't leave race out of our analysis of these conversations. So I appreciate the question. I hope to read more specifically about historically Black colleges and universities vying for defense dollars. I mean, this is a real kind of rat race between academic institutions that you literally compete with one another for access to defense dollars in order to shore up your budgets. So it's a great question.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I want to add something to this because I literally was doing a little research about this earlier today. And so I just want to read this because I think it problematizes too, even some of the ways that the Debt Collective talks about free higher education. And so I want to read this. So this is from a book. It's not a very good book, but by David Labrie, it's called. So the quote, overall federal funding during the Cold War for research of all types, this is at universities, in constant dollars, was $13 billion in 1953 to $104 billion in 1990, an increase of 700%. So in other words, during the Cold War, universities lived through like what some people say is the golden era of higher education funding. And I think this brings up and I think this is a little bit related to the HBC, the historically Black colleges question, whereby like to integrate into the dominant system, i.e. the war system, you become reliant upon this militaristic state. And I think we need to ask, is that the type of free college we want? So in other words, if free college comes because the Department of Defense ponies up billions of dollars like they did during the Cold War, because they, as you said, Nazia, we're training people to do the dirty business of killing other people. Is that the best we can do? And so I think some of these calls to free college, we got to be careful of given the current state that we live in. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Nazia, and then there's another really good question in here.
Well, that's a really great point. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is from a human, and the stack says, the student survey was very interesting. Do we have any historical data on what young people who either enlisted or fought in Iraq or Afghanistan had known about our role in these regions before they enlisted? And then the second part of the question is, do we know if this trend of disinformation or chosen forgetfulness happened pre 9/11 as well?
That's a great question. I think it's Roberto Lovato who has written about U.S. involvement in El Salvador and then the migrations of Salvadoreños to the U.S., who says like, states are manufacturers of mass amnesia. So I don't think 9/11 is exceptional in that regard. I think there's something interesting about the fact that we have a slogan, never forget, when actually it's the opposite of that, which isn't true for other things. But I don't think you can have empire with U.S. empire without forgetfulness. And, to your point about historical data, I certainly can't think of any off the top of my head, but I do know anecdotally that I have a lot of students, as I said, who themselves are veterans or are in some kind of training, who encounter this stuff in the classroom, perhaps in our classroom, and then have really fruitless and frustrating conversations with their colleagues. They're like, these are often by design, often deeply anti-intellectual spaces. If you're not familiar with them already, the Iraq Veterans Against the War organization put out a lot of really interesting writing during the Iraq War and in its immediate aftermath that dealt with, the role of people who were serving and their own consciousness and awareness. I think it was Gore Vidal who called America, the United States of Amnesia. So this forgetfulness has really, really deep roots. If you haven't yet, I think David Vine is a really great anthropologist to read about American militarism and the forgetting of it. And he talks a lot about space and place and geography. If you live in the US, you've encountered a town or place, part in a town that is called Fort whatever. And he points to how every one of those Fort whatevers was the site of a US battle, typically against indigenous people. That's a kind of forgetfulness too. I mean, you can literally travel across the country and not know the history of settler colonialism that happened right here. So I actually don't think you can have empire without a deep forgetfulness. I don't know how exceptional 9/11 is. But I think, you know, as a scholar of the war on terror, there's a peculiarity to this particular brand of forgetfulness. I'm remembering a couple years ago, the CIA tweeted a photo of the kind of weapons that it sent to the Afghan Mujahideen. Okay, and so the reason this is bizarre is because like these are the people now we're waging a war on terror against the people that we armed and trained to become religious extremists, and you guys are like this kind of like the in-your-faceness of the forgetfulness that we are fed a steady diet of is really, really remarkable.
Manny, do you want to speak your question rather than me reading? I should have said that for other people too. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just like, thank you for speaking on this, because like you just mentioned El Salvador, my parents came to the US for that exact reason. So that's why like I have some kind of ideology about what's happening here. But like one of the things that I'm like still trying to like fathom or understand in my personal life is like the actual relationship with this like generational forgetfulness that keeps happening and the rise of nationalism in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, so you take the example of El Salvador, for example, and I believe it's like before 1980, you know, there were no Salvadoreños really living in the US. And then as soon as the Civil War happens, and we call it a civil war, but can you really call it that when there's a military academy in Fort Benning, Georgia, that literally trains the military to carry out massacres of the civilians? And then you have a wave of migration. I don't know if any of you have the opportunity to teach or be in the classroom, but if you do, I'd really recommend Juan Gonzalez's Harvest of Empire, because he goes country by country by country in Latin America, from which there are migrants to the US, and then goes into a little bit of history of US military and economic involvement in that particular country. I mean, everywhere, right? Nicaragua, Mexico, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, that you can't talk about migration to the US without talking about American involvement, military involvement, whether that's direct regime change operations that have toppled left-leaning governments in these countries, or economic policy that has plunged various economies into systematic debt, as we're talking about here. And so this question of forgetfulness is really important, because the political conversation in the US on migration is like this, where the right wing will say, well, they're bad and scary and they're taking our jobs and we shouldn't let them in. And the liberals are saying, we're a land of immigrants and we should be exercise mercy on the right kind of immigrants, right? And nobody is talking about actually the root causes of migration to this country. That is, you know, this kind of military involvement. What would it mean, for instance, if the School of the Americas were commonly known and understood in US history? And there's been a lot written about it. I just off the top of my head, I'm thinking about a book called The School of the Americas by an anthropologist named Leslie Gill. And, you know, the Catholic clergy that protested against it, the students that protested against it, Latin American migrants who resisted against it. It was a really remarkable thing to think that right here in the US at military academies, the people who carried out the massacres over there that we then call civil wars were receiving their training. So the connection is direct, right, between forgetfulness and this kind of xenophobic nationalism.
Other questions or comments? We have 10 more minutes or so. I'm curious, Nazia, did you come across any numbers by any chance about the way you mentioned it in your talk about the link between the US national debt and our war machine? And I remember reading in David Graeber's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, he makes the point that, you know, basically the US national debt is a war debt. And so it's this idea that, you know, oh, they want to balance the budget. And maybe you could talk too about the US military budget and how that's been playing out over the last couple of years under Biden and others.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a, I mean, I get a lot of data from the work that you all put out at the Debt Collective. Just, you know, I'm sure everyone who's in this room is already tuned into all of the material that you have, but it's so helpful for these really and I say this word seriously, these really idiotic talking points Americans have about student debt cancellation, right? And we call it cancellation, not forgiveness. A debtor has nothing to be forgiven for. But, you know, whenever it comes up, this question of, well, how are we going to pay for it is always waved around. But, you know, I mean, wasn't like Silicon Valley Bank and a few other financial institutions just a few months ago given huge amounts of money to bail out their very high risk deposits from wealthy investors? No one asked where we're going to get the money from that from. And no one asks where we're getting all of the money that is being sent, for instance, to Ukraine, or more historically, you know, and in a more consistent way, to the state of Israel. So it's never the question of where are we going to get the money from. It's always, at the end of the day, an anti-worker position, right? That here's something that is, we know will serve as a major pressure valve on this crumbling American economy, right? This ballooning student debt that is set to be restarted this fall. And there's just resistance at every turn in American discourse when there's even just a conversation. I mean, what this $20,000 of forgiveness or cancellation per borrower was really a pittance. I mean, it was a teeny step in the right direction, but even that was met with this Supreme Court ruling, right? So it is, when I say we live in a bourgeois state, when I say that we live in a state where, you know, the ruling class is making these decisions, that's what I mean, is that at every turn it will serve as sort of a blow against the working class.
And one thing I really appreciate that you're doing tonight, and really driving home, is that there needs to be this class analysis, and it's not enough to be against debt or for debt cancellation. We have to be questioning the entire capitalist system, which I think you're driving home in a million different ways tonight. And then again, how that's linked to the war machine that we currently have. There's another question in the stack. Human, do you want to read it, or would you like me to read it? It's up to you. Okay, I'll go ahead and read it. It says, can you comment on the role of forgetfulness or erasure regarding 1967 and 1973 and the role of US militarism in Egypt and Palestine? 1948 was 75 years ago, and 1967 was 56 years ago. So
yeah, I am working on a very long comment about that in the form of my next book. Thankfully, I'm on an academic sabbatical this year, and I'm actually looking at the national security state in the US's involvement in, that's using a very neutral term for it, in the quote unquote Muslim world. And of course, forgetfulness is a key part of that. But really, I mean, I think what we're talking about is like a systemic ignorance. So what I was saying earlier about the era of American dirty wars in Latin America, like the El Salvador example, the Nicaragua example, etc. You have a kind of similar process happening in the so-called Middle East throughout the years of the Cold War. And even before that, to an extent, right? So a lot of people probably in this room know that the US overthrew a democratic sort of progressive government in Iran in 1953. But what a lot of people don't know is that right next door in Iraq in 1963, the US did the same thing. It overthrew a government that wanted to do what Iran had sort of successfully done briefly, which was nationalize its oil reserves. And in order to prevent that from happening, the US basically armed and trained and put into power Saddam Hussein, who a few decades later would be like the most evil guy on earth, but at the time was a key ally to the US. I mean, these are histories that the fact that we are able to erase and forget them is exactly a testament to the kind of systemic amnesia and systemic ignorance we're talking about today. You know, and I think a lot of people in the West are often see the so-called Middle East through the lens of like ethnic strife and like groups of people with like religious differences and ethnic differences that just can't get along, and forget the material realities of the region. You know, that the British and French sort of drew these borders in the Middle East deliberately to divide up ethnic groups and to create disharmony in places so that they could continue sort of extracting wealth from these places. And then the end of World War II rolls around and the US becomes the major superpower in the world and steps up to perform sort of the same role. And so hopefully I'll have a much longer comment in the way of a book on this question for you. So thank you.
Yeah, and I had put a link to Nazia's first book in the chat. I'll post it again in a second, but definitely recommend that. Why don't we, if there's any last comments or questions, now would be the time to ask. And if not, then Nazia will give you the last word. Where can we get the new book? Yeah, good question.
Well, it's still very much in its early stages, but if you find me on social media or anything like that, I'll be sure to be posting about it. It's in its very early stages still.
Fantastic. And I also want to say before we go that Debt Collective's Jubilee School continues this weekend into August. For the summer, we'll have fall programming as well. Here's the link for the summer courses. We have a talk this Wednesday about the University of Puerto Rico and debt struggle and resistance there, which also is definitely tied to a lot of what Nazia is talking about in terms of colonialism, imperialism, and the debts that we've now imposed upon the islands of Puerto Rico and its people. So super related there. Not to mention we put military bases there, but any last questions or comments? And then if not, we'll have Nazia with the last word. All right, Nazia.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. And I got a chance to watch the previous two events in this series. So if you haven't already, go watch them. Get really involved with the Debt Collective. You know, like I said, we're in a moment of labor struggle in this country, but the work that the Debt Collective is doing is building upon that, is showing us the power of, you know, collective organizing and solidarity. This organization has really shifted the national dialogue on the student debt question and really has all the talking points you need when you end up in one of those mind-numbing conversations of where are we going to get the money to solve this, or oh, you shouldn't have taken out that loan if you could. They've got all the answers for those conversations, and keep them in your back pocket because we need to shift the conversation on this. And this is a great place to start.
And then with that in mind, I want to thank you for adding the conversation that we're trying to develop, which is to say, like, this is more than just about student debt cancellation. It's about getting to the heart of racial, colonial, patriarchal capitalism. And you have done wonders for us in terms of political education along that path. So thank you so much again, Nazia. Hope to see you around Philadelphia soon. Thank you everyone else for coming out tonight. I know that it can be a little bit late, especially if you're on the East Coast, but hope to see you again at future events. And yeah, check out Debt Collective at debtcollective.org. These will be available as recordings on our website in the near future. So also pass those along. Thanks everybody. Have a good night.